Hi everyone, my name is Jade. I'm an independent curator based in Paris, and together with Elizabeth, we co-run XING, a curatorial platform championing visual art practices from East Asia, Southeast Asia, and its diasporas. So we're really pleased to be presenting the film program titled Fatal and Fallen, which consists of 9 films and 16 screenings and runs from September 10 to October 3rd. Fatal and Fallen is presented by Asian Film Archive, Reframe series, for which curators are invited to revisit movements and histories surrounding cinema and the moving image. So the program Fatal and Fallen looks into the trope of the deadly, fallen, and delinquent woman as pictured in East Asian exploitation films. Spanning the 70s to the 80s, the program examines Japan's 70s exploitation films, Taiwan's black films, Hong Kong's Girls with Guns, and South Korea's hostess and thriller films. These examples of cinema feature the underworld of prisons, brothels, and even homes as sites of crime, sexual desire, and revenge. Perverse and extreme, the films reproduce patriarchal and misogynistic representations of women as deranged, delinquent, and racy. So while acknowledging the inscription of such problematic representation, Fatal and Fallen attempts to locate the sociological, historical, and cultural knowledge which arises from the genres. And this is where today's panel discussion sits. So Elizabeth and I began watching such exploitation film with both fascination and ease. Something which drew us back to this film was actually this confusing spectatorial experience between the pleasure of seeing strong, vengeful women on screen, but also the pain of witnessing the reproduction of such violence and hypersexualization inflicted upon them. So Fatal and Fallen is the opportunity for us to work through this complex material. So today we're really honored to have 4 guests with us, which we will introduce very soon, to discuss the film genres presented by the program. And in this panel discussion today, we're going to introduce to the audience the 4 genres and speak of the representation of gender stemming from the films, attempting to uncover some societal beliefs and anxieties such depiction might reveal. We will also discuss the space of female subjectivity and the possibilities and limits of post-feminist readings of such production. And placing our 4 speakers and genres in conversation will also be the opportunity to think of potential influences, resonances, and dissonances within the cinema history we're studying today. And finally, if we have time, we'll be thinking about the legacy of the genres today. So we will be taking questions from the audience. So you're welcome to send these forward as they come through throughout the duration of the discussion. The earlier we receive the question, the easier it is for us to pull them out of the chat box and refer them to the panelists. So now that I've introduced myself, the program, and the panel, I'll pass on to Elizabeth to introduce herself, our panelist, and kick off the discussion.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I'm an artist and lecturer, and I co-run XING with Jade. Today, we're very, very excited to be introducing our panelists to all of you. The first panelist we have is Wafa Gamani, who works at the Cinémathèque Française in Paris, and she has curated the retrospective Taiwan Ill-Mannered Cinema before. Wafa holds a PhD in Taiwanese film studies, and her doctorate research was titled Film and National Identity, the Case of Taiwan from 1895 to now. The second panelist is Ting Ting Hu, and she is an associate professor research fellow at Wuhan University. She received her PhD at Macquarie University, Australia, and her research interest lies in the articulation of film, media, and cultural studies with feminist theories. And the third panelist is Molly Kim, who's an adjunct professor at Hanyang University. And Molly is also a film critic, specializing in the history of 1970s Korean cinema, film censorship, as well as genre. And her doctoral research was focused on the representation of women and sex labor in the 1970s Korean hostess films. And finally, we have Alexander Zoltan, who is a professor of East Asian languages and civilizations at Harvard University. Alexander has worked on popular film and media in Japan and East Asia, and his publications include co-edited volume Media Theory in Japan, as well as his book, The End of Japanese Cinema, published by Duke University. So thank you all for joining today. It's a pleasure to have you here. And without further ado, I guess I'll jump straight into this discussion. So to kick off this conversation, we felt that it would be a good start to ask you individually to define the genres that we are looking today for the audience. So in your own words, would you be able to describe the genres we are discussing today? So perhaps we can start with Ting Ting. Can you share more about the Hong Kong police crime films and Girls with Guns?
Actually, hi, can you hear me? Is it clear? All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. Actually, the organization has approached me because actually my first official publication, which is titled Transgression as Post-Feminist Masquerade, the representation of female perpetrators in Hong Kong crime films, which is published on Asian Study Reviews in 2019. So this article actually focusing on the female representation in Hong Kong crime films. In this article, I have used the post-feminist theoretical framework of post-feminist masquerade, and I actually analyzed two case studies, which are all Hong Kong crime films. The first one is The Stone Pigeon, screened in 2010, and another one is Accident, which is screened in Hong Kong in 2009. So in this article, I was interested in how the female perpetrated violence is depicted as a kind of a form to construct women's images under the dual umbrella of post-feminism and the Chinese traditional value. And I'm also interested in how Hong Kong crime films use this kind of post-feminist masquerade as a cultural strategy to reproduce some kind of intelligent and strong female characters to disguise their championing of masculine gender norm, especially in particular Hong Kong context. So my key argument was the representation of this kind of violent female transgression is strategically adopted as a kind of post-feminist masquerade in order to present a fake impression of a female empowerment to the viewers. However, this kind of graphic and vivid depiction of a female victimization, women being victimized, and some kind of abbreviated description of a female violence, female active violence, and female perpetrators' problematic desire and inevitable punishment in the end of the story. These all elements are all reinforcing some kind of traditional gender hierarchy. So that was my key argument. This article was actually a part of my PhD thesis. My PhD thesis was focusing on broader Chinese crime films, including mainland crime films, Hong Kong crime films, and the Taiwan crime films. So in my PhD thesis, I basically identified three different kinds of female characters in contemporary Chinese films, which are respectively female victims, female perpetrators, and female professionals. In particular, for female perpetrators, I further identified two different categories. The first one is passive perpetrator, which means some women who are victimized in the first place by either physical or mental violence, especially conducted by men. Then these women may transfer from some kind of victim to perpetrator for revenge or for self-defense. This is what I call the passive perpetrator. The other category is active perpetrator, which is a kind of female characters who are able to actively exercise violence especially against men, against their enemies, etc. So these are basically two different kinds of perpetrators, female perpetrators, that I identified in my PhD thesis. That's what,
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So moving on to Taiwan, Wafa, what are Black films and how did they emerge? I think your mic is muted, Wafa.
I didn't listen to business. So thank you everyone for inviting me, and I'm really excited to discuss with all of you because I'm sure it will really enrich my knowledge of Southeast Asia topic of fallen women. But I think maybe Taiwan might be a little different from other places because, as thinking who said in the for the perpetrator, but I will come back for Black movies. Black movies started somehow by chance in 1979, and it was a very short fashion, and it lasts until maybe 1983. And during these few years, suddenly you had an explosion of what was called social, somehow social realist film, which were of course very different from the socialist realist film. It's not the same. And it started with two films by Tsai Yang-ming, one called Gunshot at 6 o'clock and another one which called Never Too Late to Repent. And those two first films were an attempt by Tsai Yang-ming to present a social problem in some kind of more realistic ways. So Never Too Late to Repent is a story of a man who was a murderer, and he is saved by the Taiwanese army, like the Chinese Republican Army and the Kuomintang educational prison system that saved him from being a bad guy. But from that, there was, because the film was very popular, there was a kind of explosion, and it moved to more exploitation films. For example, in the Shanghai Society File, which is supposedly an anti-communist movie, but really became like a big hit because you could see the nipples of the actress who had a big breast, Lu Xiaofeng. So it was a kind of moving. So it's quite interesting to see how these movies were using some, good reasons such as patriotism or anti-Japanese movies, like in The Revenge of the Lady Ninja, for example, just to be exploitative films. What is also very interesting is how these films were trying to exoticize the story to escape censorship. For example, so in The Revenge of the Lady Ninja, it happens in Shanghai. It supposedly happens in Shanghai during the Chinese-Japanese War, or Female Revenge by Tsai Yang-ming takes place in Japan. All these kind of things. Sometimes Lady Avenger can be set in Hong Kong. So it's really interesting to see how to be able to escape censorship. You put the film in another time or in another place. So most of the films are really exploitative. Like it's a good reason to put naked breast at some points on screen. But it's quite interesting, and I would say they are closer to what Tintin called passive perpetrator, because, well, not so many films were kept in Taiwan, so we only have a few remaining. But from what I have seen, is that women are not
fatal just per se. They're not fatal because it's part of the being. It's always a revenge, or like in the Revenge of Lady Ninja, it's for patriotic reasons, for example, or it's a rape and revenge. So you never have just bad women for bad women or fallen women just like that. You need this reason to happen. And you also have maybe one or two examples of a more feministic approach, but I will come back to that later. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for sharing. And moving up north in Japan, Alexander, could you please paint us a picture of what it was for 1970s Japanese sexploitation films and pink film?
Sure. Yeah. First of all, thank you for letting me join this panel. I think this is both a terrific retrospective and a great group of people. I'm really happy to be part of this. So, yeah, in Japan, I think many of the things that Ting Ting and Wafa just outlined do apply in the case of Japan and what was called pink film and other categories of sexploitation film or exploitation film in Japan. I think the situation in Japan is really useful for thinking about actually what gives these films meaning and what gives them meaning differently in some ways. You have kind of different categories, or at the time in Japan, they're understood as different categories. So for example, pink film, which is basically a type of film produced by very small independent production companies under very difficult circumstances, usually shot in, these are 1 hour to 90-minute films shot in 3 to 5 days on 35mm film with incredibly low budgets. And they're circulated in theaters that only show pink films. At least by the early 1970s. And then you have films like Curse of the Blind Woman that's in the retrospective here that are actually produced by big studios and that are in some ways trying to copy some of the things that pink film is doing and is being very successful with. But in a ways, they have a different slightly different set of meanings attached to them because they're shown in different kinds of theaters. They're shown they have big budgets. They have, as we can see in this image, glamorous widescreen and great set design, at least early on. They have, there's a whole huge studio machine behind making these films. So if you compare them, they're both exploitation films and they're both potentially at some point sexploitation films, but they're understood quite differently by the audiences just by virtue of what kind of theaters they play in, what kind of actors or actresses play in the films, the production quality and the image quality and all of these kinds of things. Pink film has a really kind of realist touch just because it's almost like shooting with a video camera in your own room and backyard. This is how they're produced. In some ways, while Curse of the Blind Woman, that's really cinema. It's very cinematic. And Ecstasy of the Angels, which you have in the program, is a great example of a weird in-between film in that sense, because it's directed by and produced by Koji Wakamatsu, who's one of the huge names in Japanese cinema in the post-war, but who begins his career in pink film, and is a good example. He kind of in his youth was a yakuza, kind of belonged to organized crime organization, and then came into pink film kind of through those channels too. It was a very illegitimate type of business in the early phase, but this is actually co-produced by one of the big art house cinema chains in Japan. And he's employing, young staff and script writers who are really active in far left politics. One of them who both is one of the script writing team and acts in the film, Masao Adachi, actually has to flee the country at some point because of his association with the Japanese Red Army. terrorist organization, and he flees to Lebanon and Palestine for decades, actually. So there's a very complicated mix of politics within these respective productions, and what the people involved are claiming that they're trying to do, and things that go beyond just the story, because it's not just the story and just the representations that make sense. I mean, the representational level is really important, right? And I think we all can agree on that. I had actually an interesting quote by Molly Haskell. This is from 1974, in which she's partially referring to the rise, the international rise in exploitation cinema. And she says, from a woman's point of view, the 10 years from, say, 1962 or 1963 to 1973 have been the most disheartening in screen history. In the roles and prominence accorded women, the decade began uncompromisingly, grew steadily worse, and at present shows no sign of improving. And that's, if you're looking at primarily the representational level on how women's bodies are made a spectacle and made the the target of on-screen violence and misogyny, that's true, undoubtedly. But it's also somewhat more complicated than that. And I think Ting Ting was pointing to the fact that women are both victims and perpetrators. You have the rise of both of these at the same time in these films, and add to that the layer of who's watching these films, when, in what circumstances, and what kind of theater, who's distributing them, and all of that adds layers of meaning that makes the films actually quite complex and interesting to disentangle. And you learn a lot about what film meant at the time, what gender meant, but also what representation itself meant at the time.
Thank you. We'll be looping back to that very shortly in terms of representation and the trope of the women as perpetrators and also victims. So finally ending with hostess films in Korea. Molly, could you please tell us more about the genre? I think you're on mute.
I'm sorry, I was speaking to myself. Before I begin, is it just me? I couldn't listen to Wafa. The quality of sound was so bad. Maybe it's just my connection. Were you guys okay with her?
Is it
speaking?
better now, Molly?
I mean, I can listen to you, but it sounds so distant.
Okay, but I try to do it better. But
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a great night. I'm very grateful to be here. Actually, when I was deciding my dissertation topic, which is the worst time in my life, maybe some of you guys felt the same. I noticed there's a lot of research work done on the 1960s Korean cinema, which was considered as the golden age of Korean cinema. And also there's a lot of doctoral research and books written on the 1990s beyond, which is sort of marked by the rise of new Korean cinema, led by filmmakers like Kim Joon-ho, Park Chan-wook, Kim Ki-duk, etc. And they started to appear. This is when they decided to appear in the international film festival circuit in this time period. And when I was writing my dissertation, there was no doctoral research on 1970s Korean cinema. And I mean in English language. There's some, but even in Korean language, it was pretty rare. Because 1970s film was the 1970s was the lowest time period, lowest point of Korean film industry, influenced by rise of television and also very strict film censorship led by military regime. That's when I decided to do something that other people didn't do. And although they were so predominant, these hostess films were so predominant and popular, in terms of the number of production and commercial success. It was really, and then it wasn't really appealing, especially for academics, I think, because these films were avoided for research topic. It is because film critics and scholars consider these films as low quality softcore films that didn't have much academic value. And also politically, this was the darkest period. Censorship was at peak. Filmmakers were suffering from the government intervention, government control so much. And they couldn't talk about social and political issues. And yet sex, on the other hand, was negotiated as a carrot on stick measure. And censors let the directors have sex in trade of other political taboo. So, but you have to think this in like completely Korean context. And it's never going to be like US exploitation or Japanese pink film in terms of the level of representation. So I should say sex was negotiable when other political or social or class-related representation are absolutely impossible. Can I have that box office slide that I give you? It's oh, thank you. So this is the box office ranking from 1974 to 1979, and the highlighted titles are hostess films. These hostess films, meaning films centering around sex worker, or literally hostess or barmaid, are not produced by B-movie makers or exploitation filmmakers, but these are produced by major filmmakers who didn't have many options in terms of subject matter under the state-led film censorship. And even these directors don't want their hostess films to be discussed in public even now. Because I guess this term for them is sort of stigma. I guess this is because they were compromised and they didn't fight enough. And I thought all these issues need to be addressed on academic level, how film censorship controlled the minds of filmmakers and how this control so generated this peculiar strand of films, which I see as seemingly erotic films, but with strict moral code and gender hierarchy, which I'll back to later. And maybe because these films were targeted for major audiences, not just for niche audiences, but that's another topic that I'll get back to later on.
Thank you so much. There is a lot to unpack in each of your answer, and hopefully we can come back to many things that were said during this conversation. And maybe now, it was also, I think, really interesting to hear also about this notion of the analysis of the narrative trope, but also how there's so many different layers that we could look at, like within the space of production, distribution, exhibition of the film. And so I think this is a good exercise to do when we're going to be asking the questions as well. And so now maybe we could start speaking about some of the dominating depiction of gender in the films that we're looking at today, and the societal beliefs and anxieties that these might reveal. So Wafa, you have been analyzing the evolution of representation of Taiwanese female superheroes and their metaphor from the 60s onward. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit with us of this trajectory and what the Black film Rape and Revenge or Revenge Female Superheroes might come to kind of symbolize within this trajectory.
Okay. In fact, there is a kind of a link between the film made in the 60s and the one made by the end of the 70s, because in Taiwan, you had two types of films. You had the official films made in Mandarin, and then you had this kind of more commercial independent film made in Taiwanese language. And many directors and actors, in fact, from the Taiwanese language film did or worked in this Taiwan Black movie production time. A production that I remember. Thank you, Alex, because it was also very linked to the mafia, and the mafia was heavily involved in this film production because you could earn a lot of money. And indeed, in the 60s, so you had kind of two kinds of representation of women. So in official movies, women were more following the Confucian idealism, like obedient, being good girl, or if they were a little rebellious, at the end they went back to the right way, and they were not that rebellious. And men were always dominating. They were always the big guy, or the father figure, or the lover, the future husband, who was going to take care of the woman. But in the film made in Taiwanese, we have a slightly different model. Like women are always very strong, and male characters are always the weakest. And even physically, it's really interesting to see how the actors were different. In the Mandarin film, women are always very, very tiny, and men are big and are like taller. And in Taiwanese language film, women are quite strong, and male are not that strong, in fact. And what happened in the Taiwan black cinema, we have this kind of same thing. Like women are also quite strong, and male are also like the evil one. But I think the fact that suddenly women are rising up in the Taiwan black movies, it's quite interesting, because it would not really happen in Mandarin film, except if they had been raped. But you would not really see them acting against. I remember there is one propaganda film, and one woman is transformed into a killing machine because she has been raped by Japanese. But the rape scene is suggested, but you never see her killing anyone afterwards. She's just like presented with it. But also, the Taiwanese language film was an exploitative cinema, especially by the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s, when it was on the verge of disappearing. You had more and more film with suddenly naked women and sexy scenes and stuff like that, but it was still very crude, I think, in comparison to pink cinema. And it went on with the Taiwan black cinema when it became women being taken to prostitute houses. It was a good pretext to see them tortured or naked and everything. And in fact, the only example I have of a different and more feministic view and less exploitative is The Lady Avenger by Yang Jia-eun, and she's a woman, and you can really see a huge difference in the way she films rape and the revenge. Like, it's completely different, and she wants her heroine is sexy, but she's not exploitative in the same way like male directors will do. And you can really see the difference of look on the female body when you have a male director and a female director.
Thank you. I think it's really interesting to think also of like the presence and representation of female subjectivity behind the camera. And so I wonder how this resonates across Japan. Alexander, in your book, The End of Japanese Cinema, you propose an analysis of the image of men and women in pink film. And there you quote Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own. And I quote, "Women have served all these centuries as looking glasses, possessing the magic and delicious power of reflecting the figure of the man at twice its natural size." So could you please speak about the ways women and men have been depicted in the space of in pink film, and what cues that might offer us to understand how they picture themselves in the society at the time?
Sure, that's a great question. I mean, I think that quote is, of course, accurate, right? And as far as film in Japan, for the largest part of its history, was completely dominated by men. It's not surprising that cinema also, in some ways, served to magnify, men, which doesn't mean, I mean, similar to what Wafa was just saying, pink film, which probably it's very difficult actually to do audience research on these films, but we can kind of, from some reports, we can kind of assume that 99.9% of the audience watching these films were men, and the staff were almost exclusively men, at least in the first 10 to 20 years. There's some notable exceptions, but overall. So it becomes, and the theaters, right, are become inaccessible. So this is the point when it's with pink film, when pink film exclusive theaters set in, that you suddenly have theater spaces that only men inhabit. Whereas before, you know, the theater space was much broader. It was, you know, adults and children, male, female, fairly mixed. And then suddenly there's a split and you have this hermetic space that's only for adult men, right? So what's going on then? What are they showing each other, right? Sitting together in the dark. And why then, in a similar way as what Wafa was pointing out, are many of these films so dark and, you know, nominally they're sexploitation films and for titillation, but actually they're deeply pessimistic, full of angst and anxiety. The men are like, you know, in the first 10 years of pink film, like it seems like 80% of the men are impotent, can't, right, have lost their jobs and can't compete in society. And in the end, that often erupts into violence and often against women. But it's certainly not something that is if you watch the films, it's not something that men would watch and come out of with a kind of boosted sense of self-confidence. So why are they watching it, and what's interesting about it? And why are they eventually, and that does happen by the late 60s, early 70s, also watching all these films with women that become avengers and take revenge and kill and cut down all these evil male protagonists. What's the joy in making and watching those kinds of films for an all-male in-group, so to speak? What are they getting out of that? That's a really interesting question. One of the interpretations that I set up for that, and I'll stop there, although there are many other things to mention about it, but is that I think there's a kind of double identification going on at that time in Japan specifically that has a lot to do with the geopolitics and the larger situation of in Japan, in which men sitting in these theaters identify both with the male characters and the female characters, right? They both feel as victims, right? Japan is you know, officially independent after 1952, but it's covered with American military bases and obviously under the American umbrella. And there's a kind of clear gender geopolitics going on in which Japan is suddenly gendered female. The US is kind of the male marriage partner. That's a typical kind of Cold War relationship, right? And yet at the same time, that kind of the burst of male violence that in a futile way rebels against it is also something that the audience can identify with. So it becomes a very complex kind of, and often confused, I think, field of emotion that people go to experience in these films. But it's not as simple as just go in, you know, watch these misogynist portrayals and then come out and feel kind of boosted in self-confidence. It's a bit more complicated than that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's really interesting to think in terms of identification that allows for kind of a more complex understanding of the way that films were consumed. And so, Molly, maybe it would be interesting to hear you speak in the context of the hostess films. And I was wondering, so compared to the hyper-visible and kind of brusher display of violence in Taiwan and Japanese and Hong Kong film, it feels a bit more psychologically insidious when we speak about hostess films and chamber dramas. And so I was wondering if you could speak about this type of violence
What is interesting? What is the interesting thing about Korean hostess film is, to me, the fact that these women are represented very sacrificial and caring figures, as opposed to femme fatale that we are talking about, maybe in like I don't know, like Avenger genre and other type of female cop films in Hong Kong. And of course, they're absolutely not sexual beings. And for one thing, there are some sex scenes in these films, but the camera always shows women's faces completely deadpan and or crying for no reason. And actually, most of hostess films start these young women come to city from rural area to make money for the family as a breadwinner. So it's a very fixated narrative. There's not much variation from this very prototype. And they gradually become a fallen woman in this, city setting. And I guess this kind of narrative choice was made because even though these films were marketized for their erotic theme and ambience, but sexually active women still cannot be the major character in Korean films yet. But then we could have this poor sexual worker who inevitably took this job to take care of her family in the films. And also, in fact, this is sort of this is partially understandable because this time period was dramatic level of industrialization was taking place. So there was a massive scale of migration to city from rural areas among young women to look for jobs. So film and literature did incorporate these social changes as well. And like I mentioned, these women in hostess films are far from the traditional notion of femme fatale. And what you have seen from Kim Gi-young's Hwanyo, which I believe you played today, I think, it's like his women, like strong and fatal women, are not the norm for 1970s Korean cinema. It is ironic that 1970s was the only time period that the majority of films were starred by the female protagonist. But still, it is hard to say these films addressed femininity as what it is or what it means. In terms of the level of violence, it's not really explicit as with other genres that we're talking about. But I want to say the motif, the representation of rape plays an important role for these kinds of films, because these girls don't just decide, oh, I'm gonna go to city and make money. It always happens after them getting raped in their neighborhood. So it becomes very critical motif for them to go to city, because it's already ruined life from their perspective. So I think I wanted to I think I'm gonna, maybe if I have time, ask you about that point of view, because I've seen sort of similar narrative device in some of Japanese films in the 1970s, 80s film. This rape motif is so prevalent. It's especially in Wakamatsu Koji's film, as I observed, and maybe Alex can respond to that later. So yeah, and but even though this whether the woman make her choice by herself or it's first one, I think these films did demonstrate some important value, because some early hostess films, foundational hostess films, could be, before they became clearly industrialized, addressed some workplace issues like violence done onto women, discrimination, and not to mention rape issues that frequently took place in workplaces. I think those kinds of issues were never really represented in major Korean cinema before the emergence of hostess films.
Thank you. Yeah, it would be great to come back to this rape motif maybe after this. And before we do so, Ting, I want to ask you, was the other trope in the previous genre see woman characters? Sorry.
Yes, I think what the female representation that Vafa, Molly, and Alex mentioned, these representations are closely related to what I mentioned, the passive a passive perpetrator in Hong Kong crime, in the context of Hong Kong crime films, because we all know that detective crime genre is really a very popular genre in Chinese context, and Chinese film really like to depict some kind of a story format, like a male hero rescues female beauty. This is a very popular narrative format. For me, exemplified in my case study, these kind of female characters, they have some really outstanding features. For example, these female characters might be very kind-hearted. They are usually very nice and desire for love. And these women are mostly mostly hurt. Emotionally hurt by men, especially by perhaps their father or their male partner, etc. And they are able to exercise violence against the women to defend themselves, especially after revenge, after being raped, etc. However, in the end of these stories, these kind of female characters tend to be punished by a higher level of violence, and this kind of violence tend to be depicted vividly and graphically on screen. So this is what I'm interested in. This kind of a standard format in Hong Kong crime films just delivered a kind of a sense of discouraging women's violence, discouraging females violence, and encouraging male heroism, because these female victims tend to be saved by some male heroes, and it also delivered some kind of female inferiority in the heterosexual relationships. For me, in a Chinese crime, Chinese crime film context, especially Hong Kong crime films, this kind of like a sense of that female perpetrators can be saved romantically by male heroes. In other words, he's to some extent she is put into a dangerous place, a dangerous situation through exercise female violence, because this kind of a female violence is usually not vice. They can be very emotional, sometimes being mad. They use violence to define the social system or social regulations, and then they just put themselves into women. I mean, put themselves into a dangerous place, and then some male heroes came to come to rescue them. In this situation, the male violence of saving women is some kind of being glorified as a higher power and for a greater good. Because these men, they are heroes. They're saving the women, and they're saving the world. They're saving people's lives, etc. When this female violence of self-defense or revenge, some kind of dislodged or depreciated in this social context. And I think this kind of a female and the male representations in Hong Kong crime films actually make male protection in a heterosexual relationships necessary. For example, it's something to me like justify male violence as a noble thing, but female violence like a stupid thing. Further, although this female perpetrator is capable of using some extent of violence, she tends to be represented as prioritizing her personal relationship, especially personal heterosexual relationship, prior to anything else. Well, the man always has a higher concern for the whole world or for the society. So this representations actually reduces women's social impact to some extent, eliminating the threat of female violence, which means female violence is not compatible to male violence. Female and male violence just they're not in the same level. They're not compatible, and it also reproduce a kind of a traditional gender hierarchy, because male are usually be represented as hero, and the women just use violence emotionally, and this violence may put themselves into the dangerous situation. So this is what I sense in Hong Kong crime films.
Thanks so much. I would like to actually tie that into coming back to the rape motif, about how female violence is not compatible to men's. And maybe this is a question for everyone, but Molly or Alex, feel free to respond. I was wondering, what are your thoughts on how the rape motif surfaces in the genres, and how does this compare to explicit violence?
Was it for me?
It can be for anyone, but
anyone. Maybe should I start? In fact, yeah, this rape motive is very interesting. And what about Molly said that for in Korea it was when girls go to before they go to the cities are raped. In Taiwanese film of the 60s is after they go to the cities that they got raped, and the fall start from that. And as for this rape and violence on a woman's body, I think it's like in Japan or any other country, it has also this kind of metaphorical meaning, especially in Taiwan at the time when it was a very social, like politically it was really violent, like on two levels. On one hand, the Republic of China, because it was always still the Republic of China, and the Nationalist Party being in power, was abandoned on the international level. So you had this kind of thing, like kind of abandoned body. But on the other hand, people within Taiwan that were revolting against the government were also being jailed or killed or eliminated. So you have this kind of two levels of comparison. And yes, but I think the rape aspect really depends also on who is shooting again, because in film shot by men, you can really see there is this scopic pleasure of seeing women being raped and tortured. You have a lot of scenes like that, or girl being raped or being tortured. And in the film made by Yang Chia, you see it's very different. The way she shoots the rape, you don't see it, but it really looks like a work clock orange with this woman being swung by men. And that's what you see in the film. It's kind of more about humiliation rather than you are more focused on the woman really feeling rather than the men desire, I would say. So I don't know how it works in other cinematographies.
Can I chip in? In case of Korean cinema, I think especially in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, because the film censorship was so severe, sex act couldn't be represented. It has to be either as a rape, the process of rape, or sex labor. So I think that's the reason why filmmakers use rape scenes legitimately sometimes, but many times just for sexual spectacle. And for politically motivated filmmakers, especially I'm talking about the films in the 1980s, we have this movement called Korean New Wave. And these filmmakers were so eager to make politically provocative films. And then they employed this rape motif as their resistance against military regime. And that became part of conventions of how they make Korean New Wave cinema. And I think it's kind of similar to other country, other national cinemas, especially those who went through military regime, when they wanted to make some sort of resistance films, because they couldn't say whatever they wanted to say about this, political criticism, they sort of use this metaphor as, resistant theme or resistant agent, especially the woman as a victim. So that's pretty much one of the biggest, or I should say, salient tendencies that you can see in the films produced from the 1970s and 80s.
Yeah, maybe I'll chime in too. So I think Molly made two great points that also are often mentioned by actually filmmakers in Japan that were kind of involved with pink film specifically, that said that on the one hand, that kind of rise of violence, sexual violence on screen, of course, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly directed against women, that has to do with a certain generation that had a wartime experience, and it's almost like a traumatic, repeat or a reliving of trauma in a sense, again with a kind of weird multiple identification going on. Maybe others have made the same point that in terms of the censorship situation, actually it wasn't easy to have an explicitly sexual scene, so twisting it in a kind of sense to make it a scene of violence made it paradoxically more acceptable to censors. I mean, those are possible explanations. I think there are other potential ones for pink film. I find it really interesting to look at the way that also this changes over time, because in a weird way, more than in many of the other East Asian contexts, pink film became a kind of time capsule. It continued, right? So it didn't just disappear at some point as a kind of part of the industry where films were made, until very recently, still on 35 millimeter and shown just in these theaters and so on. You can actually see the changes over time. And so you have, if we're talking about the trajectory of especially sexual violence in pink film, what you find is that in the early phase, in the early to mid 60s, it's a lot of it is very much couched in these social narratives of, yes, exactly, sexual violence against a young woman in a rural space who then goes to the city, or a young woman goes to the city and then is raped and then the downfall begins, kind of, is a very typical kind of story. By the late 1960s, early 70s, these are so well established kinds of tropes that what you find is a weird kind of formalization, and it becomes very standardized. Pink films have, every 10 minutes, there has to be a sexual scene. And so that makes it like something like 5 to 6 sexual scenes per 1 hour film, which means, and then there's a variation, at least 2 of those have to be scenes of sexual violence, right? And that becomes kind of a standard of writing a script. And audiences know that, and the script writers know that, and everyone knows that this is it's a pattern. So what sets in is, in a weird way, an aestheticization that divorces these kinds of scenes from the social context and makes them just into kind of, okay, how can we make this interesting and different compared to what people have seen before? Right? So there's that's when things like bondage films become popular, and you have these elaborate bondage scenes that are really less about portraying a scene of a sexual act than showing this kind of highly aestheticized scene of bonding, which doesn't mean that it's not still about women being tied up and made immobile, right? But it's the kind of, potentially for audiences, it means something different. Similarly to what we just heard also by the late 80s, mid to late 80s, sexual violence becomes again kind of experimental and highly politicized. And then in the 90s, it almost disappears from pink film. There's a whole generation of pink filmmakers in the 1990s that are not interested in that at all anymore. So, and you get these small scale, intimate stories of everyday life. And by that time, the audience has largely said goodbye to pink film. And these are just filmmakers making the kinds of films that they would like to make. And the pink film spaces where the films are shown are now, by that point, largely cruising spaces. So they're queer spaces at that point that people go to, a lot of homeless people go to sleep, and that other people go to make sexual encounters, right? So they're gay cruising spaces and spaces for cross-dressing and all kinds of queerness. And that's kind of interesting too. How does a space like that begins as a highly gender segregated space that seems to be there to reinforce gender lines, and also, of course, a kind of hetero-patriarchal situation, become queer cruising spaces? There's a kind of seed of that in some ways in the homosociality of the all-male dark theater space that's set up, that's established by pink film in the 1960s. But you know, that trajectory itself is kind of interesting.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing. Yeah, just looking at everything that has been said in this conversation, it feels like there's so many corresponding threads and resonances across the genres. And of course, like now that we have the honor of the four of you here today, we'd like to take this opportunity to explore some of the like resonances across the region. And with what you've just said, Alex, about the whole like aestheticization of violence and divorcing it from the social reality, I'm wondering, does this also occur in the other genres in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Korea?
All right. I think that these representations may just remind me about the female representation of femme fatale in Hong Kong crime films, because we see a lot of femme fatale in French movies, in Hong Kong movies. That's just a very, very popular representation. And for me, I think femme fatale is totally different from what I mentioned about the passive female perpetrator, because passive female perpetrator was just transfer herself from a victim to a perpetrator. They tend not to experience any victimization in the beginning of the story. So they just highly professional, highly skillful, specially trained for like killing people, like female killers, female assassins. For this kind of femme fatale in Hong Kong crime films, I think they are able to use intensive violence to define the male power to kill men, to kill people, sometimes for wealth, sometimes only for their ambition. For this kind of femme fatale in Hong Kong crime films, these kind of violence could be regarded as a post-feminist masquerade if we discuss these films within if it was a feminist discourse, because they are not actually powerful. They are just looking seemingly powerful. What I mean here is these women is usually presented as having the intelligence to manage their task, to kill people, to like steal something in a highly secure place. But her intelligence level is not enough to save her life from in the end of the story from the hand of her male supervisor. So these are kind of another standard narrative format in Hong Kong crime films. So we can see here an intelligent woman is not capable of competing with a highly intelligent man in this sense. And once dare to challenge the male authority, challenge her male supervisor, she tend to be punished, and her punishment is inevitable. So in this sense, this kind of a female violence, we can see it like a post-feminist masquerade, because in this sense, these women's intelligence and the seeming empowerment actually are not real, and not true, because ultimately what she is trying to do is just fail. It's a failure, and her final repression by the male supervisor, but by the male authority, is inescapable. Sorry, I didn't really prepare any picture for the audience. Sorry for that. I think this is a very interesting point here.
Thank you for that, Ting Ting.
Could I add a little something? Because I think what you said, Ting Ting, is really interesting. And I was wondering about Taiwan black movies where, okay, it's always this passive perpetrators, but most of the times they're also taking revenge for another woman. I don't know, their stepsister, real younger sister, has been raped, killed, or something. And at the end of the film, they are not saved by men, but they are stopped by law. There's also, because it's Taiwan, so you cannot be like kill people and escape. So you always have the policemen at the end, or the police cars arriving. But sometimes it's quite interesting to see how they still remain a kind of hero. Like they need to do the job that no one will do. Like no one is gonna, try to stop women, like prostitutes, from being killed, or and in this Yang Chaoyin film, The Lady Avenger, I think it's really interesting because it starts with a girl being raped in a car, and she's during her trial, she's dismissed because she was wearing sexy clothes. And so when the heroine is raped afterwards, what she says, I have to take revenge because no one in this men's society is gonna believe me. And it's quite modern for an 18th film. Like there is really something. But yes, at the end it's not men, but it's like the superior authority of the government, of the law, of the police, stopping these women. But male characters are so horrible in it, like being all rapist or very coward, that it's quite interesting to compare both.
Thanks for that. It's just a tiny reminder for viewers to submit your questions before we start to wrap up the session. But I wonder if Alex or Molly has anything else to add in terms of finding resonances in like the queering of space, but also sisterhood as well.
It's a little different thing, but can I add to Alex's accounts of 1970s pink film?
Of course.
Actually, Korean government banned the distribution of Japanese films until the late 1990s. We couldn't watch any Japanese film until the late 1990s in Korea. But before that time, many filmmakers from the 1970s and 80s copied those Japanese films. I don't know how they did it. They did it anyway. So we have a lot of Korean films that are identical to Japanese film, especially during the 1980s. For example, I was so surprised to see this apartment women series, 단지처 장르 in Korean, which was a subgenre film for Nikatsu Studio, and they made it in the late 1980s. And these films were exactly so similar to Korea's 1980 Madame series, like Emma, Madame Emma, Madame Bovary, which is clearly motivated by French films. The story itself is just characterization and how sex takes place. It's all these tropes are pretty much same with Nikatsu films. So it's interesting because they completely localized sex scenes and the motives of women for Korean film. And this is something I want to do for my next film project, to trace out how this sort of implicit cultural exchange between these two countries, Japan and Korea, during this period before we have this deal to openly exchange their cultures happened.
Yeah, I think Molly makes a really terrific point there about the question. We've been talking a lot about the specificities of each of these film industries and the forms of production. But of course, what brings us all together here for this discussion is the fact that there's actually something going on that seems to also be occurring regionally and maybe even globally in some ways. And often it's really tricky to figure out how that spreading of that those themes and tropes and narratives and representations and industry strategies too occurs. And as Molly said, a film from Japan was illegal to screen in Korea for a long time, and yet there were remakes of Japanese films, quote unquote. There are many different ways people were sending scripts back and forth and whatnot. So what's going on? I think there are two different things. Maybe on the one hand, there's concrete exchange where actually people are seeing, okay, this is successful over there, and that's a possible path for us too, to try it out and see if we can, this is a money-making strategy for us as well. But also in terms of concerns and what are the larger underlying, rougher, not so localized kind of factors that encourage these kinds of portrayals, and especially around gender violence, sexual violence, and so on. Why is that suddenly something that has this high spreadability at that point in time? I think there are different. I mean, we can only speculate about those things, and there are different ways to explain it. I mean, we're also all talking about one side of the Cold War sphere, so that probably plays a role. It's also a certain kind of social transformations, I think, in the various wartime industries, women were in the workplace suddenly in ways they had never been before in kind of modern economies. Then in the 50s and 60s, this retrenchment, men return from war, re-enter the workspace. There's a kind of push to push women back into the household, at least in terms of the public image, right, of what the ideal should be. And then by the 70s, then women re-enter, right, higher education and the workspace again. And I'm guessing those kinds of transformations also play a huge role in the concerns of audiences, what people think can be transformed into cinematic spectacle that attracts audiences. So it's many different factors possibly, but it's a tricky problem, and we're kind of left to interpreting it rather than being able to prove it.
Thank you so much. So we're going to try to wrap up this session, being conscious of time. I just had the final a question for Wafa. You just mentioned same in Taiwan, and I was curious as to what was the similarity you were referring to.
It was the fact that so many films were copied from Japan, like since the 60s, especially when the Japanese film were forbidden in Taiwan. But also in the series, we have like the Revenge of the Lady Ninja. She's trained in Japan, and we can see also this very complicated relationship between Taiwan and Japan, and the fact the film were made by people who were born during the Japanese era, so very much attached to the Japanese culture. But also, if you take the women Revenger, it also takes place in Japan, and you can see when she's playing the dice with her half naked arm. It's really like clear references to all the Japan women, like bad women and gangster women thing. So that's why it's quite interesting to see how Japan and Japan can also be seen as a country of evil, like the place where girls, our Taiwanese girl or our Chinese girl are being treated as prostitutes or something like that. You can have a many layer discourse in all that. So I think it's quite interesting to just to compare with Korea and other countries and all the exchanges.
Thank you. So now maybe we can open to the questions. I wonder if the audience has any questions for the panelists. Otherwise, we also have a few questions, further questions, and actually, I think I would be interested in hearing what has been your experience of researching these films, because it feels that some of them are kind of difficult to access. So I don't know, for example, pink film being shot on 60 millimeters and therefore kind of wild screening being damaged, and also I guess small investment in preserving titles. So I was wondering, what was your process of research, and how did you access the material, and how did you work also in the absence of film? Maybe I can, yeah, whoever wants to start.
Okay, maybe I start if no one starts. In fact, I think the first time I heard about this film when I watched the film Taiwan Black Movies made by Ho Chi-jan. And at the time, it was pretty hard to find the films. And we can see this difficulty in Su Hui's work that you're screening, Revenge, Women Revenge. Because him, Su Hui, for his work, his experimental work, is only start because I asked him, have you seen the film? Because I thought the way he was interpreting the film was quite special. And he told me, no, I just had all the posters we had in this kind of student canteen with women half naked and with knives and everything. So he really starts from just the posters. So I think it's quite interesting to have such a memory of film you haven't seen. But otherwise, in the late years, because Taiwan Film Institute started to restore the film, and because of this documentary, more and more people were interested in this Black movie movement. They try to, not to restore, but at least to make this film available. And some of them, in fact, are available in terrible quality on YouTube. So you can find them. I think it was a way of, but otherwise, yeah, they are lost between Hong Kong and Taipei, and there are only few left of this time.
Yeah, I can jump in and yeah, it's so again, it kind of depends on which part of the sexploitation production in Japan we're talking about. So the big studio films are generally somewhat more accessible. So films like Curse of the Blind Woman, that's in the retrospective here. The Blind Woman's Curse, sorry. This is a great image, by the way. And we can see in the background, actually, people who were involved in Buto dance, which was a kind of modernist style of dance that were being employed in a lot of the films by this director, Ishitero. So there's this weird crossover, again, of high and low culture that's taking place in these films. But also, it points to their budget capabilities, too. For pink film, which was a huge part of the industry, and at certain points in Japanese film history, half of all film production was pink films, just quantitatively speaking. And I did actually count the different types of productions for the late 70s. And in 1978 or so, it's something like 81 or 82% of all films are pink film or studio-produced exploitation films, or what we might call exploitation films, sex films. That's 80%, more than 80% of the total production of Japanese cinema at the time, right? Again, the studio films are somewhat more accessible. The pink films are almost completely inaccessible because no one collected them. They were seen as trash, and there was little journalistic interest, no academic interest. They were quick, dirty, fast productions, and once they were screened, they kind of went into the vault or were thrown away. Although the pink film theater circuit in some ways functioned as a living archive, because at times when they didn't have enough films, they would just show older films once again. So a lot of the research that I was doing was, getting to see everything that was available, which is not a whole lot. Reading some of the publications, looking at posters and all those kinds of ephemera that are connected to the films, and especially talking to people in the industry that were involved in the making and distribution of these films. And directors like Wakamatsu, who's very famous, but also much less well-known names that were maybe established within the industry, but just not publicly at all respected or well-known or anything like that, which meant they were usually often very surprised and happy that someone was at all interested in what they had done. Also what that allows you to do is also look at some of the other factors. So there are some few female pink film directors, and again, their films are practically inaccessible, so you have to talk to them directly. And one of the most important producers / distributors of pink film is a woman called Sato Keiko, who's now retired but still around, and she's been producing films since the mid-1960s. And her take on, this industry was invaluable and really, really interesting. And that's something you wouldn't ever be able to get or just to access through the films. You have to actually talk to people involved in the industry.
Thank you for sharing. So just to conclude with a final question, it goes back to, the nature of exploitation film, it being complex, messy, unpleasant most of the time, but it also stands for anti-establishment thoughts, which platforms, outcasts, as well as the other. And as the exploitation canon is continually being reassessed, redefined, as well as mediated, we would like to close with this legacy, however contradicting it may be. So this is going to be like a question for everyone, and perhaps we can go around. And moving on to today, to what extent have these genres been analyzed, studied, and reassessed, and how do you see them moving forward, especially being considered in the wider realm of cultural production?
Hi. Based on my years of that is focusing on.
That was me.
Okay.
Which one? I can go second. Which one?
You go.
Is it XING or me? I mean, can you say, Elizabeth?
Yeah.
As you wish.
Go ahead.
Okay. Go first.
Okay. I'm sorry that I thought it was.
No worries. It's okay.
Yeah.
No worries. Just go ahead.
I just wanted to say these sort of, I think I'm including hostess films. These films were not taken seriously by critics and scholars until recently. And mostly because of their seeming nature, I think. I mean, it's particularly so in Korea. And I think there are more and more doctoral research getting done on those hostess films from 1970s and erotic from 1980s these days. But still, we do more research, especially on sexual representation in Korean cinema and how it was politically negotiated, and how sex as a concept and as an act was used in the later Korean films. I still think many Korean scholars are shy to talk about sex in public. I published a book on Iraq cinema 2 years ago, and the host of the event stopped reading out a chapter from my book because he said it was too embarrassing to continue reading. So that's the environment still, and because of this sort of sensitivity with the subject, I think there is clear avoidance of this topic, and but we do see more research than before, which is a good thing. But hopefully more and more proactively, I think.
Thank you. So Ting Ting, over to you.
All right. I was just mentioned based on my years of research on broader Chinese cinema and particularly interest in Hong Kong cinema, I just noticed in this field, in this area, the scholars studying angle and focusing angles are not that abundant. So that was I want to mention it here. First of all, I noticed some scholar may pay special attention on remarkable directors or remarkable works, typical works in Hong Kong film. That is really an important stream of Hong Kong film studies. And the second stream perhaps is a female representation that we have discussed a lot tonight, particularly on gender politics in China, gender policies in China, as well as gender politics in Hong Kong as a special region in the broader China area, and also gender identities and the gender identifications, including LGBT identifications, etc. And some scholars may also pay attention to some relevant gender or sexual issues in the global or local politics, especially under the umbrella of feminist theory, post-feminist theory, and post-colonial theories. That is a huge stream and very important stream of film study in Chinese context. And another thing is very interesting thing is one very important female representation is female warrior. A lot of people just pay a lot of attention on female warrior, especially in a special genre. We call it martial arts. Female warrior in martial arts. So that is what most scholars are paying attention to. But what I noticed in the recent years, especially in an area where women's contribution to the society at their educational levels and their employment, their contribution to the whole world is visible. It's visible. So in this condition, in this condition, sometimes the filmmakers may like to just all to shift their attention from stigmatizing women, stigmatizing women once in a very one-sided level, and shift their attention to a kind of cultural strategy by representing seemingly powerful women in disguise of repressing these women, because some seemingly powerful female characters in the story we always find they are being repressed in the end, or sometimes to some extent protected or saved or redeemed by their male counterparts. So that is a really interesting point that I mentioned, because stigmatizing women directly may not work that well as a strategy for preserving the male dominance and the male authority. So since it's easy to be criticized, so these female characters, these female makers just tend to use a kind of this, what we said, masquerade cultural strategy to focus on female empowerment, and use it as a strategy to some kind of defensive strategy for the male dominance. So that is what I think is very interesting in the context of Hong Kong crime films.
Thank you. So our panelist Wafa has to leave now, but if she has any closing thoughts or comments, feel free.
Yeah, just because about the question, and maybe I will answer not as an academic because I'm more working as a film curator, but I think it's quite interesting to see how these films are curated. For example, the Taiwanese black movies or now the Taiwanese language films. Like for many years, it's not some official cinema, some official festival are showing like the big masters, but other festival are trying to screen other films, and Taiwan black movies were part of them, and that's how they were rediscovered. And recently, the Taiwanese language films, and it's also what we see with Su Hui's film and installation. So he's using this film as a starting point, even he hasn't seen them because, well, he's not doing research on them. He's just using them as an inspiration. And his installation were shown in Taiwan, but also in Rotterdam and traveling. So I think it's also a different way of having this film reassessed and also restudied. Like we still in the academia, we see there is a new interest for the film of the 60s and maybe later the film of the beginning of the 80s. Sorry, and I'm sorry I have to go. I have my work working, like waiting for me. So thank you very much for the invitation, and it was incredible to discuss with you. I have learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wafa, for joining.
Thank you so much. And well, I guess to just wrap things up with you, Alex, if you have any concluding thoughts before we close this session.
Yeah, concluding thoughts. I mean, maybe on the to touch upon the question about the research on pink film or how pink film was in some ways rediscovered also at some point, also through, as Wafa was just discussing, through film festivals and screenings and retrospectives and so on. There's always a kind of how films also enter into scholarship, and academic scholarship is also interesting, right? It's often that films or certain bodies of work actually kind of filter through film festival screenings or retrospectives, and then people in academia get interested in them. And pink film, I think, was similar. There were kind of some retrospectives in the mid-90s and late 90s, 2000s, at festivals like the Rotterdam Film Festival or other places. And through the early 2000s, that led to a kind of new interest, and some became released on, some more recent pink films became released on DVD, and that sparked many people's interest. That always has its trappings because, of course, that means there's always a kind of politics of cultural capital or so going on. So you have to find a way to make it legitimate to watch these films, right? Because many of them are really unpleasant to watch. They're really misogynistic. So some are also not that interesting, actually. I mean, or many are not that interesting just as films. They're kind of boring to watch, and you kind of wonder, I mean, that makes it interesting. What fascinated people at the time about it when you yourself are just both appalled and bored, right? But, you know, for both actually for academic writing and for something like curation at a film festival or so, people have to pick specific films that can serve as entryways and that kind of make it legitimate and respectable to watch them. And that means a lot of the early focus was on political pink films. And so films like Ecstasy of the Angels, which is part of the retrospective here by Wakamatsu Koji, and a lot of Wakamatsu's films, which are quite explicitly political and have very kind of explicit leftist politics, that kind of almost in a weird way served as a justification for, okay, it's okay to watch these films now. Apart from the fact that they're also decades old, which makes it easier to distance yourself from them and so on. So I think once that entered into academic scholarship, that tendency in some ways persists, because, you know, a lot of academics love to write or try to valorize what they're writing about and try to, in some ways, endorse it and say, yeah, yes, it's problematic, but look at the radical politics of it and so on. And therefore, it's a kind of good object, bad object game. But I think more recent scholarship, there is really interesting recent scholarship that really complicates the picture of pink film. So people like Kim Reversi or Mike Arnold or so have done really important work on looking at the complications of pink film rather than trying to say, okay, it's a good object or it's a bad object, and trying to figure out what we can actually learn from looking at pink film. But in general, that kind of drive that you have to justify why you're looking at these films and not something much more wholesome or acceptable in line with kind of what is seen as good politics. And also, as Molly mentions, I think there's a special justification that has to come in when it involves sexuality and explicit sexuality. It's not just South Korea. Of course, it's the US as well, where that, right? Porn studies is now somewhat more established, but I know of many students and graduate students that have been discouraged from focusing on that and making it some part of their work maybe, but not making it the main focus because their advisors are really worried if they will get a job later on with that kind of topic, right? So there are all kinds of levels involved that make certain kinds of scholarship on these topics possible and discourage others and so on.
So I think I can't find a better way to close, ending on the complexities of pink film and also just its messiness, but sorry, not just pink film, but exploitation films in general. Its messiness and also its strange power to lure people in and grab our attention. But at the same time, us kind of hating ourselves sometimes for enjoying these scenes. So I would like to thank all of you guys for making this panel today, for everyone who's watching, and as well as our panelists for sharing their insights to what has been a very complex but a very illuminating discussion. Just a reminder that Fated and Fallen, we're running until the 3rd of October at the Asian Film Archive, and it's screening at the Oldham Theatre. So if you're based in Singapore, please do check out the program. And yeah, we'll be ending this session. So thank you all and bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.